10 Ways Jack Reacher Really is the American James Bond. Alan Ritchson's recent comment about Reacher essentially being the American James Bond is surprisingly accurate, with both properties sharing links. Reacher star Alan Ritchson believes the show is the American James Bond, due to similarities in the lead characters in both properties. Both Bond and Reacher value intellect over brute force, but will use violence when necessary. Amazon owns both the Reacher TV show and the James Bond movie franchise, which highlights their shared facets. Even though Reacher and James Bond don't share a direct connection, several arguments support the opinion of Reacher star Alan Ritchson, telling Entertainment Weekly he thinks his show is essentially the American James Bond. Bond and Reacher share a great deal in common, despite being created in different countries, decades apart from one another. So far, every James Bond movie predates Amazon's Reacher TV show, although Tom Cruise's 2 Jack Reacher movies were released during Daniel Craig's reign as 007. While every James Bond actor brings something new to the role, the basic character remains similar to Reacher. The first James Bond movie was 1962's Dr. No, and while the first Jack Reacher on-screen adaptation was Tom Cruise's 2012 movie, Amazon has since rebooted the franchise. Now, Alan Ritchson embodies the hulking American, and has done so since Reacher Season 1 began in 2022. As such, Ritchson is only the second actor to step into Reacher's shoes, whereas several actors have portrayed Bond through the decades. Regardless, it's difficult to ignore the other connections between Bond and Reacher. Reacher and Bond both perfectly blend brains and brawn. Ritchson's character matches 007's level of balance. Given the action-led nature of both franchises, it would be easy to have a protagonist who is always looking for the most explosive option. However, James Bond and Jack Reacher aren't just brutal killing machines. While both men certainly have long histories of violence, it's rarely their first option. Instead, Bond and Reacher make use of their intellect to analyze a situation before taking action. If bloodshed can be avoided, both characters will almost always find an alternative plan that circumvents the need for confrontation. That being said, it's clear that both Reacher and Bond share a quiet enjoyment of violence. So when a scenario arises that calls for immediate action, neither man is disappointed by the call to arms. Their intelligence doesn't just help with the planning stage either, but also in the mostly flawless execution. Reacher and James Bond regularly switch love interests. Both characters have various romantic partners. A steady romantic relationship isn't something commonly associated with either Reacher or Bond. In fact, 007 has been with so many women that it led to the creation of the Bond girl category. While Ritchson's Reacher is still only 2 seasons in, he has been involved with a different love interest in each installment. Given the anthological format of the Amazon show, this is likely a trend that will continue, leading to a new addition to the Reacher Season 3 cast. By the time Connery's third Bond movie came around, Gay Sun had been dropped and replaced by Honor Blackman's Pussy Galore in 1964's Goldfinger. Like Reacher, James Bond also partners with a new woman in almost every movie. The exception to this rule is Sean Connery's Bond being involved with Eunice Gayson's Sylvia Trench in Dr. No, and the next movie, 1963's From Russian with Love. By the time Connery's third Bond movie came around, Gay Sun had been dropped and replaced by Honor Blackman's Pussy Galore in 1964's Goldfinger. Amazon owns the Reacher TV show and the Bond movie franchise. Amazon bought the rights to James Bond in 2022. In a somewhat meta-revelation, Reacher and the James Bond franchise are now both the property of Amazon. While the James Bond movie rights had belonged to MGM since the 1980s, Amazon's purchase of MGM in 2022 means it owns the Bond movie franchise. Reacher's situation is far less complicated, as the show is an Amazon original and always has been. Although it's unlikely that Amazon is making a conscious effort to connect Bond and Reacher, the shared ownership highlights their shared facets. When it's considered that Amazon is the driving force behind both James Bond and Reacher, the high-budget action sequences in both franchises suddenly make much more sense. Bond movies have been an incredibly profitable endeavor through the decades, so it would make sense that Amazon would gravitate to purchasing such a similar property and continue to apply such a familiar framework. James Bond and Jack Reacher keep their cards close to their chests. Both characters need their feelings coaxed out of them. Reacher is an incredibly hard man to read, which is a personality trait shared by his British counterpart. Neither character is prone to volatile emotional outbursts, instead letting a level head and precise action do the talking. Bond and Reacher also aren't associated with big speeches or lengthy rants. Instead, they tend to get their respective points across in a measured way that takes as few words as humanly possible. While no version of James Bond has ever been particularly emotive, Daniel Craig's version of the character is a paragon of stoicism, and is therefore much more akin to Richardson's Reacher than the other Bond actors. Even though both characters favor a truncated form of communication, it's quite often a very effective method of getting their thoughts across to their allies, or even their enemies. Both characters trust very few people. Bond and Reacher have a revolving door of allies. It would be inaccurate to say that James Bond and Jack Reacher have enormous social circles. Instead, both men only regularly associate with a select group. Even then, it's rare for them to voluntarily spend time with more than one person at a time. Furthermore, there needs to be a very good reason for them to not be alone at all. What's interesting is that the smattering of individuals in each man's respective circle are primarily former colleagues or allies. For instance, Bond is close to almost no one he meets outside a mission, with M being the closest thing he has to what would be considered a traditional friend. Similarly, the surviving members of Reacher's 110th Special Investigators Unit make up almost his entire collection of comrades. While this seems to suit Reacher, Neagley warns her former commanding officer, at the end of Reacher Season 2, that keeping the 110th at arm's length won't be tolerated anymore. For Bond, his eternal solitude is his own decision. Bond and Reacher are both fearsome in armed and unarmed combat. Reacher's training is at least as good as James Bond's. It's well established that neither Bond nor Reacher should be trifled with when they have a gun in their hands, with Bond even having a preference for a specific model of firearm. What's interesting is that when both men are disarmed, their effectiveness in a fight is barely reduced. Bond may not be a physically imposing man, but his abilities in a hand-to-hand brawl are almost unmatched due to being trained in martial arts. Reacher is naturally very strong, but his time in the military makes him an even more imposing presence when the guns are put to one side. The sheer size of Jack Reacher gives him an advantage in a close-quarters fight, and it isn't one that he squanders. Reacher is naturally very strong, but his time in the military makes him an even more imposing presence when the guns are put to one side. What he lacks in speed and agility, he makes up for in quick reflexes and brute strength. Reacher's crazy abilities are perhaps best displayed in Reacher Season 2, Episode 2, What Happens in Atlantic City, when he kicks a stationary car so hard that the airbags deploy. Thanks for watching this video. Please hit the subscribe button for more update news.